Okay, get set up and we'll wait a couple more minutes in case anybody's running late, and then we'll get started. And while we're waiting for anybody else to show up, go ahead and open up brackets. So for some of you, it might take a little while. So on this computer, I already have it installed, but it should be in your downloads on most of the computers in here. And then remember, it won't install to where you can drag it over to applications, but you should still be able to click it and it'll open. It might take a little while the very first time. But go ahead and do that while we're waiting. We won't wait too much longer. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So right now we have assignment number 1 due, but I think most people probably already finished that. But if not, that is due today by the end of the day, so 11:59. Make sure to get this completed because 9 points, that's a large chunk of your grade. That's almost an entire letter grade, essentially an entire letter grade. Does anybody have any questions about assignment number 1? Okay, so with that, assignment number 2 has been posted. It'll make sense once we have today's lecture, but just keep the due date in mind. So normally I like to do like somewhere between 1 to 2 weeks. I realize a certain number of students are going to be watching this from home. I usually try to make things align to the class date, like on Tuesdays, but I realize that some people aren't going to necessarily watch this for maybe a couple of days. So I give a few extra days on the due date. So rather than having it due on a Tuesday, it's due on a Friday. So just keep track of that. And again, same thing, due by the end of the day, so 11:59. And this will make sense by the end of lecture. So pretty early in the semester, so not a whole lot going on as far as announcements. Everyone who needed to watch the lecture was able to access it, correct? Did anybody have any difficulty getting on there or anything? Okay, perfect. So I guess let's get right into it. Everyone has brackets working? It's open? No issues there? Okay. So let's do our normal thing that we do where we create a folder for today. So today is 9/8/2020. Then inside of brackets, we will point to that folder. By the way, so one thing I used to do is point over here and then go to open folder. I think in reality, I never even thought to use this technique, but you can just as easily go over to File, Open Folder, and then open it. So I'll do that one more time. So rather than trying to find this little thing here, which is kind of like it's a little bit difficult to see, you can just go to File, Open Folder, and then find your CGS1821 folder, and then today's date folder. And then now anything that you create will default to this folder. Makes it a lot easier to keep track of things. You won't lose things so easily. Okay, so you've got that open. And then the other thing we want to have is in Blackboard, have these resources open because we're going to use some of these during class. And I think the thing that we're going to really concentrate on here is just this one, W3 Schools HTML. So have that open. Maybe the article tag is worthwhile as well. But really, we're going to focus here on this HTML tutorial. Now, this is week 3. So at this point, I'd imagine everyone's hopefully pretty comfortable with, give me 1 second here. I'll add another link later. Should be fairly comfortable with the basics of this. So like I said before, we're ignoring this, and we're just concentrating on the stuff inside of body. And so we have these things, these tags, and they occur in pairs. So we open up an H1, close an H1. With H1s, we have H1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think there's even a 6. But that's the level of heading. If that's confusing at all, the example I always like to go to is Wikipedia. Then we have other things like paragraphs and articles and so forth. So huge number of these tags. I think I have a full listing of all of them linked somewhere. If you're ever curious, W3 Schools, they have them organized. Now clearly you can see that there's way too many to go over in class, but what we typically do is I'll introduce a few of them, like H1 to H6 paragraph. There's one here, it's called like structure or something like that. Yeah. Div we'll often do, header, footer, main, section. So a few, maybe, I don't know, 10 to 15, somewhere in that range. And then it kind of gives you the feel of how they work. And then from there, what I'll typically do is take you through very special tags that aren't super intuitive. So those two are going to be lists and tables, which we'll go over today. Okay, so that just kind of gives you a sense of where we are in the course. So in this W3 Schools, let me go one bit at a time here. So I'm on W3 Schools HTML. And then the very first example right here, let's try it yourself. Let's use this as the starting point. Okay, so everyone still remembers how this works. These occur in pairs. And then let's go ahead and take this whole thing. Make sure you've gotten all of it. If you want to, you can do Command A or Control A. to highlight the whole thing to make sure you don't leave off any individual characters, and then copy. So we can't paste it in here yet. What do we have to do first? We're inside of brackets. We've pointed it to the folder. We went File, Open Folder. We pointed it to today's folder. What do I have to do? Yeah, we have to create an empty file first. So we go to File, New, and then we can paste in our HTML. You'll notice that right here we have what's called the syntax highlighting, these various colors. This is what's called syntax highlighting, and it gives us visual cues. It helps us spot errors and other things. But we don't have that here. It's because it doesn't know it's an HTML file yet. So right after we've created a new file, it says right here that it's an untitled file. It doesn't know that it's HTML. So what we have to do is we have to go to File, Save, and notice that it defaults to the correct folder because we did File, Open Folder before. And then what we want to choose is, we'll call this first file ex1.html. Be very careful on typing that. Just like I almost made a typing mistake there. It's very common that I'll see people like, they're like, why don't I have syntax highlighting? And then I'll look and it'll be like ex1.htl or something, like they missed a key. And just be very careful how you type these. And then because I typed it correctly, notice we get the syntax highlighting. There's one quick extension I think we talked about. Did we talk about Beautify? Okay. For those that don't have it installed, you go to, try not to move too fast. Under here, Extension Manager, you click this. Go to Available, and then you type in the word Beautify. I don't think you have to type that many characters in before it shows up. Yeah. So for me, since I already have it installed, it's asking do I want to update it. I'm not going to worry about that right now. But if you don't have it installed, there should be a little button to install. So again, I'm under Available. Click Install. And then the thing you can do afterwards, so that every single time it beautifies, you check Beautify on Save. Now what does Beautify do? Well, one of the things that we want to do is every time we, yes? Say it a little louder. Oh, it's this. I think it sort of looks like a Lego. And then make sure you have it under. So you have Available clicked, and then you start typing it in from there. There might be another way to get to it. Okay. Every time you open up a tag, you're supposed to indent one level. This is for readability. Now notice, for whatever reason, W3 Schools, they didn't do that. They had everything just aligned left, which is not a great way to format, because once you get into a very large page, like say for example IRSC's page, which is probably very, very large. So if we view source, ignore all this. Notice that this is a very complex page, but because it has this indenting right here, the idea is that hopefully it makes it a little bit easier to read things, because I know that things line up a certain way. They're a part of, like they're embedded. Okay. Now, our simple pages, even though we're not going to be nearly as complex, we still want to follow the best guidelines. Now, for people who are brand new to this, I've noticed that they make mistakes a lot regarding indenting because they're trying to do too many things at once. So this Beautify, what this does is it automates a lot of that process. So as soon as I go to save, I'm going to do Control S, or we'll be very specific about it. So we'll go to File, Save. Hold on. You have to modify it, and then there. Okay. You have to modify it first, and then it takes. Otherwise, you can just go to Edit, Beautify. And then notice that because H1 and paragraph are inside of body it indented correctly. Even though we haven't talked about this yet, there's another spot here called the head section, that indented title. So you get the idea. So we've talked about these very basic tags. We have our paragraphs, our H1s through H5s, and so forth. We can always preview our page going here, and it has a built-in web server. Or if you find the files directly on your computer, so here I am in the CGS1821 folder, today's date, you can always just open them inside of a browser. And that works as well. One of the nice things about using the built-in web server is that it automatically reloads, and I've noticed that sometimes people have difficulty finding the files, so it's a little bit faster. It cuts down on some common errors just using this built-in web server, so I typically say to just use that for now. And by the way, you don't have to, you can just minimize the browser. Every time you make a change, let me see if I can give it, so you don't have to worry about doing this, but let me see if I can demo this really quick. So I'm going to put this right next to, so instead of this is a heading, we'll say this is an H1. Notice as I'm typing, it changes it. So it's nice. Otherwise, what you'd have to do is you'd have to click this refresh button constantly. Okay, so let's clear this out. Let's start with our H1. Okay, so H1, the purpose of that is that it could be the title of a page. So if we had a page about just IRC related things, we could type IRC. Do that. Okay. Notice that it's kind of bold and it's slightly larger. When we first start this course, all we're concerned about is the structure of pages. We're not concerned how they look. When we get into an area called CSS, that's when we start to, that stands for cascading style sheets. The important part of that is style. That's when we actually start to style pages and do some basic formatting and changing things like fonts and so forth. HTML, all it's concerned with is the structure of the page, saying that this is an article, this is a paragraph, this is a header. We're not saying anything on how it looks. So why is H1 bolded and slightly larger? When they first created HTML in the early 90s, they weren't going to have any sort of separate stylistic things. It was just going to be HTML, and certain things were automatically styled a certain way. Then probably mid to late 90s, they realized that's not a great way to do things, but people had already sort of, it's hard to go back on that sort of decision, so you have to be additive. And so they added CSS, but they didn't want to break old pages. So that's why we still have this behavior today, is that most of these tags have some sort of default styling, and we just kind of have to deal with that. Don't try to change things based on, like, if you don't like this bolded, change this to a paragraph. If it's the title of your page and it fits as an H1, change it with CSS later. Don't say, oh, I could change it with changing to a paragraph, but that's not really, we don't want to go down that path. Okay, so you already should know H1s and paragraphs. Last time we talked about the article tag. And remember, the way article works is that it's supposed to be like some sort of contained, I hate to just use it in this definition, but like think about like a newspaper article. Is that we might have the article, the title of the article, and then some paragraphs. Last time, and also note that there could be multiple articles on your web page, just like there could be multiple articles on one page of a newspaper. It's not that uncommon to have multiple articles. Now, it's very often the case that these are like automatically generated from like WordPress or from a database or something like that, but you could manually have multiple articles as well. We'll just have one article for now. So what we'll do is, this is the title of our page, and then we have one article. And then remember what I said last week is that we can put tags within tags, and that's very common. There's only a few exceptions that we can't do it. That doesn't really make sense. Like it wouldn't really make sense to put a paragraph within a paragraph. But in this case, you've got the article is kind of like the outside container of everything. And then within that, we want to put H2 for the title of the article. So it could be IRC wins Aspen. Let's do it proper here. And then we might want to have 2 paragraphs in here. So we'll fill in the stuff inside of the paragraphs in a minute. Let's just get the structure down for now. I realize a lot of this is review. Since this is kind of a new subject for most people, what I normally do is a lot of review at the beginning of class. We're a little bit crunched for time because of the format, the hybrid format, but still try to get through at least maybe one example of review. So one of the things that so we've got the article, and that matches opens and close. H2 matches opens and close. Same thing with the 2 paragraphs. Now what can we put in the paragraph? Well, we could do this, but that's not super great. There is pseudo-Latin text for placeholding called Lorem Ipsum, and we're going to use this all the time in the course. So if you go back to resources, the very top link here, let's go ahead and have that open for the rest of class. And then you click this button down here and it gives you a bunch of paragraphs of Latin text. What's nice about this is it makes for a good placeholder because Latin is the character set that we use in English. So if you kind of just not focus your eyes too much, it kind of looks like English. But the nice thing is if you're creating a website for somebody and you don't have the real content yet, you're just focusing on layout things, it makes for a good placeholder. If I had just mashed the keys on the keyboard, that'd be a really bad placeholder. It doesn't really give you a good sense of certain things. But this, because it looks so much just like a paragraph in English, and for space purposes, because I have the font so large here, I'm going to just only grab a few sentences. And we'll go ahead and put that inside of our couple of paragraphs. Okay, everyone's good? Now remember, this is what's called white space independent. So if I were to do this or hit the enter key, it's going to be the same paragraph because, again, it doesn't care how many times I hit the enter key or any of that. It just compresses everything down to one space. Remember we did the example last week where I hit the space bar a bunch of times and it compressed this all down to one single space. If you don't remember it, I'll go ahead and go through it here real quick. So this is called white space independent. Well, it's what's white space, the space bar, the enter key, or tab. Doesn't really care how many times I press it. It compresses it down to just one single thing. Now obviously if I don't have any spaces, it's all clumped together as one word. But what that means is that I can make my paragraph like this. And to me, this might be a little bit more readable. Now your goal is always to have things as readable as possible. Okay, so choose readability first. To me, having the paragraph like this and then wrap around like this is probably more readable, so I'm choosing that. Here, the H2, maybe this is more readable. For some of you, maybe this is more readable. I would leave that up to you, okay? To me, this is probably, because it's such a short sentence, this is probably sufficient. Now, another common tag is footer. What might we put in our footer? Well, let's go to the IRSC page. And what are the typical things? So this thing down here, this would typically be the footer. Okay. Now we're not getting that sophisticated just yet. So if we wanted to, we could just put this, just copyright 2020 IRSC. But you can get, very sophisticated. And the idea of this, none of this stuff is set in stone. So your concept of a footer might be a little bit different than mine, but footer would typically be just something at, at the bottom of every single page that might be like extra information. So again, like contact information or something else. Like if we're to click admissions, notice that this stuff doesn't really directly have to do with admissions. It's just the same on every bottom of the page. Okay. So let's go ahead and use that tag. That's a common tag that you'll see as footer. And we'll be just very generic. We'll just say copyright 2020. That's probably it for that example. I don't want to get too complicated. I kind of want to get into today's material. So, any question about this example? I'm trying not to go too fast. But we are limited on time. So if for some reason you fell behind a little bit, don't forget that I always put the code in class examples, and from there you can download it. And let me make the fonts a little bit smaller so everything fits on one page. Give you like 30 seconds in case anybody needs to type anything, and we'll move on. Everyone's good? So let's move on to, I don't know if I have a specific link in here. If not, we can get to it from W3 Schools. Okay. So close some of this extra stuff that we don't want. Maybe we'll use that later. I don't really care about that. So under resources, let's go back to W3 Schools HTML. And then you should see a link. So if you scroll down a little bit here, you'll see links, images, tables. And so we want to talk about lists first. So as I previously mentioned, most of these are pretty self-explanatory, like these tags. It's you learned how to use footer, so I think most people in here wouldn't be a huge stretch of the imagination to all of a sudden try the header tag. And some have a little bit of structure to them, like article. You usually want to put like an H1 or H2 in there and some paragraphs. But in general, they're pretty open. Div is very generic. I don't think we've done an example with div, but div, you can put anything in there. Div just stands for division. It's not really saying anything about it. But there are a few elements that require some specific structure. And so I like to go over those separately. Those two are lists and tables. There are others. If you ever take like the senior year version of this course, there are other things that we'll learn about. But for this course, the main two that I want to concentrate on, tables and lists. So okay, everyone's at W3 Schools HTML, and then you clicked lists. Everyone's good. So we can see that there are two types of lists. there are ordered lists and unordered lists. Now, as I mentioned before, you get some default styling with these, but I wouldn't think about that too much because we can always change everything with CSS. If you don't like the look of something, I know it's difficult right now because you might want your page to look a certain way. You're just so limited in what you can do in HTML. I would say just don't even worry about it right now because once you learn CSS, it's going to be like a huge set of tools available that you can change stylistic things all of a sudden. So try not to concentrate on that too much right now. So the unordered list is going to be anything where the order doesn't matter. It should be pretty obvious. Now, what are typical things? Well, what I like to always reference is like a grocery shopping list. So if you're going to the store, at the end of that shopping trip, it doesn't really matter which order you collected the things for the most part, just as long as you leave the store with all those items. If you're following a recipe, then you'd need the ordered list because the order does matter. Like for example, if you try to cook the thing before you even put the ingredients together, you just kind of put an empty pan in the oven. Order matters. Or like if you tried to change your car tire before you even took off any bolts or anything, that sort of thing. So ordering does matter. Now by default we get some styling. So the unordered default is going to be a bulleted list or a circle. I don't know what they refer to as. And ordered is just going to be numbers. But we can change these. We can actually even get rid of these altogether with CSS. So let's click Try It Yourself. Now, I don't really like the example that they give. So here, this makes sense. Coffee, tea, and milk, because this is unordered. But then they also use it in ordering, and to me, this doesn't really make sense. Sometimes they have good examples, sometimes they don't. So let's do this. So you can see here, the way we set this up, our page is the same as normal. We've got the stuff up here that we're going to ignore, the stuff down here. And we've dealt with H1s and H2s before. To me personally, I would have probably made this an H1, but whatever, they made it an H2. I guess it makes sense because they have an unordered and ordered, but whatever. And then our unordered list. So the way we do this is we have UL for unordered list, and then within that we have individual list items, which are LI. And the structure of this it's very important to have this structure. So I can't have an LI just by itself. That doesn't really make any sense. Okay, so it has to be in either a UL for unordered list or an OL. When you define these, you also have to have those. So I can't have an unordered list and like something like this. Doesn't really make sense because I have to have individual list items. So the structure of lists is very important. And then let's go ahead and just so we get some practice with list items, let's add a couple of things here. Let's go ahead and add bread. So just add a couple of grocery items. Now, I don't really care for this ordered list that they did, but rather than trying to change this in W3 schools, let's go ahead and go to brackets and create a new example. So I went to File, New. Then we're going to take this and then copy and paste. So again, I like to do Control A, or in Mac it would be Command A, Control C, or Command C. And then to paste, if you want, you could just do edit paste or Control V. Be very careful. The reason I like to use that Control A is because if you forget one little character at the end, like this, it's not correct. You have to copy and paste every single thing down to the very last character. And then we don't have syntax highlighting because it doesn't know that it's an HTML file. So let's go to File, Save, make sure it's in the correct location, which it defaulted to for us, CGS1821, today's folder. And then we're going to call this ex2.html. Okay, make sure that .html at the end is very important. Make sure that you have that. And then save. And then now all of a sudden we get our syntax highlighting. Now, I don't like this ordered list. So just so we get a little bit of practicing, let's just get rid of this whole thing and let's write the ordered list from scratch. So from here, including the OL, let's just create it from scratch. So to start an ordered list, we do OL. Now, I don't like to type code one character at a time. Usually it's a good idea to do things like all at once. What I mean by that is notice how that, and it kind of did it for us anyway, is that we do the OL and then we close it at the same time. We wouldn't type out the whole list and then close it. It's a good idea to work like this. You may have been doing that already if you've been following how I code, but just keep that in mind, is that we try to kind of have the big picture of everything, is that what are we trying to do? We're trying to make an ordered list. So let's open and close that right away. Then if we're trying to make a list item, same thing, we open and close it right away. So let's just do how to toast bread. And we get the preview over here that everything worked correctly. So everything should be good with this example. Lists aren't super complicated, it's just it needs its own explanation. I want to add one more thing. Try not to get too complicated. One thing that we'll often do, and we're going to learn about how to do hyperlinks maybe at the end of class, like just a very short example. You might think, how often are we actually putting lists on our website? If I'm not doing a site about, you know, like a recipe website or something like that, or any sort of step-by-step directions, how often am I actually putting these things on our sites? It turns out a lot, because anything that could be a list, we will often do that. So what I mean is there's a navigation tag here. It's called nav, That would be your site's navigation. So if I were to go to the IRC website, this whole thing up here might be wrapped inside of nav. If I've got a bunch of links, you could kind of see that as an unordered list. The ordering of the links doesn't really matter. It's not like you're getting any sort of step-by-step directions. So what I can do with all those links, or I can wrap them in a UL, unordered list. And we're going to learn how to do links later, but let's just for now, let's say maybe there's a link for the home page. Maybe one for admissions. River Mail, and so on. We'll do one more for help. Now it's not going to look anything like a navigation that you've seen before. And let's do this. We'll put an H2 on top of it, just since we're already labeling things. But as I mentioned before, it doesn't matter how it looks because we're going to change that look with CSS. We can actually completely remove the bullets. We don't even have to have it stacked like this. We can use something called Flexbox. And what that'll do is that'll actually arrange it horizontally. And we can do all kinds of interesting stuff with that as well. But that's to kind of give you a real world example that we're not always just doing like grocery lists and stuff like that. Just something as simple as a bunch of links on your site is typically wrapped in nav. I'm sorry, within a UL. One other thing that I want to very briefly address is you might think, why go to all this effort? Okay, we've got it inside of a nav, we've got it inside of UL, we've got list items. Couldn't I just put it in a bunch of Ps, a bunch of paragraphs? You could. What you want to try to do on your site is give it the most meaning. So why do I care about that? So for two reasons. One is that at some point, if you're trying to promote your site, a search engine is going to go and crawl your site. Google, or maybe some other, but for the most part, you're probably most concerned with Google. And they're going to go to your site, and they're going to look at your site like you would as a person. And they're going to say, what is the main content? What is the navigation? Have you ever done a Google search before and it comes back with like a bunch of links next to it? So it'll have like the main link to the site, but it'll have other links like downloads, or like if it's like a restaurant, they might have a link to order, even though you're still on Google search. So a lot of the search engine crawlers are actually smart enough to look at this and say, oh, because this is your site's navigation, I'm going to treat this differently when I return search results. I might do something interesting with this. Same thing with with footer. Well, footer is probably not as important. So if somebody's searching for something and it returns results inside of the footer, like a generic word like employment, that might not mean as much versus if it's inside of an article, like some text in the middle of the page, article. So that's one reason. Search engines are getting very smart, and they can treat different content on your page differently. One minor reason is just because it kind of, as you're developing your page, it makes it a little bit easier to make sense of what the content is. And then the final reason is what's called accessibility. So if somebody has some sort of screen reader of some sort, and they go to your page, well, there's all kinds of content on your page. How does it know what to read first? Like if somebody's blind, they actually have software that'll actually go through and read all the different things on the page. But this is a very large page. What does it think to read first? Well, it might decide to read the navigation first. Now, I don't know the specifics of how they work, but in my mind, typically you would probably want to read the navigation first and any sort of H1s, H2s, that sort of stuff. And then it might go into individual articles and start reading those. So it's important that you actually give your page some structure, even though you could technically get away with just using paragraphs for everything. You kind of want to give it that structure. And that's why we go to so much effort to give it proper structure. Okay, so that's lists. To me, they're mostly straightforward, but they just require just a separate example to explain how they work. Any questions at all? Okay, so now we'll move on to tables. Tables are a little bit more complex, but not much. So we're going to be back at the W3 Schools HTML site. And then right next to lists is tables. Okay, so we scroll down here. This is the basic structure of a table. Don't worry about this part right here. This is actually CSS. We don't care about this right now. I don't know why they added that. The way we define a table is that we have the table tag right here. And then we define tables one row at a time, which it might be a little bit outside of what you're used to. Like if you're used to Microsoft Word, you kind of have this idea of a column, and you might do something with a column and talk about things column-wise. But here, it's not like that. We have to deal with tables one row at a time. And so what we do is we have this tag TR, which stands for table row. And then we have the individual cells. Now, notice that we have some that say TH and some that say TD. Most tables, you're going to treat the first row differently. Like you're going to basically set it up as a header. And you can see that here. If they're listing, say, a bunch of students in a class, they would have their first name, last name, and age. This first row right here with the THs, this would be the header. And then from there on, we have, so TH actually stands for table header. And then from there, we have TD, which is just plain old table data. So TH is the very first row describing what the content is. And then from there, we have the actual data. And here we have 2 students. Okay. So let's do this. Let's click the try it yourself. And then let's grab this whole thing and then bring it over to brackets. So I can do Control A, Control C. File new. Paste it in. Then you can save it as ex3.html. Make sure that you have the .html. That part's very important. ex3.html. Okay, and I'll go through that process one more time. So I was at W3 Schools. Scroll down to where it says HTML tables. There was an example here. Simple HTML table. I clicked the try it button. That gave us all of the code, which this try it editor is okay, but for very limited things, this is kind of a large example. And what I did is I did Control A to highlight everything, Control C, or Command A, Command C. And then went to File New. That got me a new file. So I had to paste that in with Control V or Command V, or you can just go to Edit, Paste. And then I saved it, so I did Control or Command S, and then I called it ex3.html. So So the first thing I want to do is get rid of the CSS because we're not ready to talk about CSS. So let's just have a plain old table. And actually what we can do is we can cheat a little bit just so we can see where everything is. We'll do border equals and then double quotes 1. Now you wouldn't typically use this, but because we don't know CSS yet, this is just the easiest way to see a border, but not a super great thing to do long term. So we see the structure of this. Let's go ahead and try to create it. Actually, let's go all the way. Since we're doing good on time, let's try to recreate a new example from scratch, because it's always a good idea not just to copy and paste code. You want to actually type it out. Yeah. So remember, we start off with an empty table. Now we're going to cheat a little bit and say, okay, give it a border. And then remember, we have to define things one row at a time. So rather than having people names, let's just do some animal names, I guess. And remember, we define these things one row at a time. So we're saying that the first row, which is going to be all of our, excuse me, our heading, so all of our heading columns, I shouldn't use the term columns, we don't really think like that, but all of our THs, so we're going to say so we'll say name, and then we'll say the type of animal, if it's a dog, cat, bird, whatever. And then we'll stick with the age, I guess. Now if we bring our browser up here, we can see right here, name, type, and age. You can kind of see a little bit of a border. But don't depend on that too much. I just wanted you to see the separation between rows and columns, or cells really. So now we create another row. Spot the dog. Oops. So I'm just going to retype this from scratch. So it's not only the first row is going to be the TH. From there, we're just saying that it's plain data. So not TH, we do TD. Now notice by default we did get some styling. That TH actually gave us name, type, and age as bold. But we don't really care about that too much. We're not going to really depend on that. So we can always change that with CSS. So if it turns out that you don't like the bold, there's ways to change that. We wouldn't change this from a TH to a TD because really it's the heading, or it's the header row. So take about 30 seconds and then add a row of your own. Just, I don't know, Garfield, I guess. So on your own, create another row. Just so you get a little bit more practice. create real quick. So we've got our table row. Remember, we define these things one row at a time. We have our table data. Table data. And then also remember that it has to line up with the number here. So we have 1, 2, 3 items. Each of these is going to line up. Name lines up here, here. Type lines up here, here, here. And age lines up here, here, here. Okay. Any questions about tables? So the main takeaway is that we define things one row at a time. So the first thing that we do is we wrap the whole thing in this table tag. And then from there we start defining it one row at a time. The first row, in general, is going to be a TH because you kind of want to say what the things are. And then from there on, you'd have the actual TD, your table data. Now, a quick note. Historically, back in the very, very early days when we didn't have as many advanced things that we could do in CSS, like now we have like grid and other ways to do layouts, what people used to do is they used to put their whole web page as one large table. And then if you create your entire page as one giant table, it made it so that you could do columns. Because the original HTML, it was very difficult to do like columns, and even very, very basic layouts were very difficult. We've since solved that with some tools like Grid, and there's actually we have a few tools available now. But it's generally not a good practice. People used to do it because they had to, but for some of you who might be like trying to get ahead and thinking, oh well, I could start to do site layouts with this. It's generally not a good idea. There's just a lot of reasons it's not a great idea. The only type of data that you'd want to put in a table is what they call tabular data. So if you've got like, if you're doing scientific experiments, because remember that's what Tim Berners-Lee was, a scientist. So that sort of thing you might put inside of a table if you have like 10 runs of an experiment, and then each time you noted, say for example, how long the mouse stayed around the cheese or something like that. Or if you're doing something maybe like an inventory, and you've just got a big table of each item, and then maybe the last time it was inventoried and how many items were there, that sort of thing. You wouldn't want to lay out your entire site. It's got to be data that sort of naturally falls into that table. Okay. So let's go over to your assignment. I'll give you a few minutes at the end of class to at least get started on it in case you have any questions. One more very brief thing I wanted to get to. So you're going to have 2 files. So when you go to submit, I don't want you putting this all in one. It's easier to do as 2. Create an HTML table of your current class schedule. I realize that with everything going on that a lot of people are taking online, you can just make up classes if you want. Get to around like 5 or 6 classes. I've seen some people do some interesting classes in the past, made up classes. That's fine. If you're just taking one class this semester, it's kind of boring to have a one-row table, if you're just taking this class. So if you have to start making up classes to get to 5 or 6, that's fine. And then some of the requirements, so the first row needs to be a TH, and then you need to have TDs. The things that you need to include are the course title, instructor, and meeting days. Now I'm not being very specific on this as far as like how to format it, because I want you to start to think about these sorts of things. So it's up to you. You may want to do each class as a row. That's fine. Maybe you want to do like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, each as a column, that sort of thing, and then mark. I've seen some people do some interesting things in the past. So I'm not being overly specific on how to format it. It's just the information has to be there. Does that make sense to everyone? What actually might be easiest is to actually sit down with pen and paper and draw out and sketch out what your table is going to look like. And that's, in general, a good piece of advice for this sort of stuff. And then second, I have a web page here, and essentially it's how to scramble eggs. It's a very simple recipe, and you're going to do the ingredients as an unordered list, and the directions as an ordered list. And I don't think they have very many directions. It's like 2 or 3 ingredients or something. It's a very simple recipe, and then like maybe 3 steps. Now, if you want to do a more complicated recipe, you can go out there and do that. That's fine. I'm just keeping your life simple. Okay, any questions? Since we have time, let's do one more thing, and keep an eye on that due date. I think for most people, if you were able to follow along today without any issue, it's a pretty short assignment. Now, you could copy and paste it. I would suggest at least the first time through is to maybe try to type this stuff manually, because just copy, paste, modify, just going through and say, okay, modify this, you're not really learning as much as if you type it out from scratch. I would say, unless you're really lost, if you're really, really lost, then you could maybe use that as a skeleton, as a starting point, but maybe just try to create it from scratch if you're doing okay in the course. Okay, so one last thing I want to talk about are hyperlinks. And I don't know if they have a specific thing. We'll just talk about it because it's going to be very brief. So let's just take one of our old pages and we'll copy it. Get rid of everything in the middle. And we'll save this as ex4.html. So get like the most basic page. You can just take one of your previous examples and just get everything in between body, wipe it out, and then we'll start this from scratch. So one of the most important advancements of the web, and it's kind of in the name, web, is that you could link to other pages using what's called hypertext, meaning that just with the just being able to click a link, I can immediately go to a different, what they would call a document, what we call a web page. And we don't even think twice about it today. Like I gave an example earlier on the IRC web page. I just go here and I click and get to the information that I want to right away. But before this, it was very common just to have a bunch of distinct documents that weren't interrelated in any sort of way. They might have actually said, you know, for more information about health and wellness, and then they would just tell you how to find the information, but you couldn't go as far as just to click and go somewhere. Now, Tim Berners-Lee didn't invent this, but he made it, kind of popularized it, made it easier to use. And so the way we do that is, let's say, for example, we have a paragraph. There's a tag called A. It stands for anchor. Now that may seem like a strange name, but anytime you think of it, just think link. I think they had other intentions and other uses for it that back in the early 90s, but in practice, almost all the time you use this anchor tag, it's going to be for a link. Then we have an extra piece of information. So this is called an attribute. And there's an attribute called Href, H-R-E-F, which stands for hyperlink reference. And let's just leave that blank for now. Okay, so just get to where you've got this basic structure. A, href equals, and then a pair of double quotes. Close the tag out, and then we've got our basic skeleton. So this thing right here, anytime we give, let me take a step back. Up to this point, every time we've created a tag, we're essentially telling the browser how to display it to the user. So we're saying, this is the text that we want the user to see, and it's a paragraph. This is the text that we want the user to see. This is an H2. This is the text we want the user to see. This is a footer. So you should be able to see this common pattern that whatever is displayed between the tags, that's what the user will see. Now this thing right here, this is information given to the web browser. So let's just, I'm just going to, you can manually type this if you don't want to copy and paste it. So https:// or you can just go to IRC's web page and copy and paste it. So what this href stands for, hyperlink reference, this is saying to the web browser that when this user clicks this link, this is where I want you to go. And we'll talk about this thing later. It's called a URL, Uniform Resource Locator. We don't really care about it too much. You've probably seen it before, and to you it just looks like a website thingy, right? And then we're almost there. We've given the web browser the information that it needs. We said, okay, href equals, and then this is where I want you to go. But we haven't told the user anything yet, so we might write link to IRC. This part is given to the browser. This part in orange. This is what the user sees. And then when we click this, so it says link to IRC, just like I said, that this is what the user sees, and then the browser knows, okay, well, when they click this, it's probably complaining because we're going to an external page, but then it took me to the proper page. I think that's about all I want to talk about links for today, just to kind of get us in the right mindset for next class. So we don't have an assignment on that right now. It's just to kind of introduce you, because it's there's different cases on how we use links. This is like the simplest of all of them. Okay. So that's a good stopping point for today. So we don't have a huge amount of time left, but maybe some of you can just kind of get started, maybe just read through the assignment, make sure you understand it correctly. Does anybody have any questions on anything? Okay, so main things, keep an eye out for announcements. If you think of anything, email me. If not, I'm going to cut off the